Welcome to The Disciplined Life. I'm Aria.
And I'm Coda.
We use our experience as a married couple living in a domestic discipline marriage to talk about the ups and downs of implementing authority structure and domestic discipline into modern relationships.
Let's do it. Hello, everyone.
Hey guys, on today's podcast, we are going to be talking about staying in position during a punishment. But before we get started, if you are not already, please subscribe, like this video, leave it a comment. It really does help out the channel. And if you want bonus content and you want to support the channel further, a link to our Patreon is down below. So this topic came from not only a comment that we received here on YouTube, but also a suggestion that we got from one of our patrons. And that is how to maintain position during punishment, because last week we talked about how maintaining your position is a sign of consent. It's a sign of actively participating in the discipline process. And so it's really important to do that. Maintaining position is not only important because it is an act of consent and it's actively participating in the punishment process. It is a point of obedience to your head of household, but it's also important for the practicality and also the safety of punishment.
But you're absolutely right. This can also cause your head of household to be, rather than concentrating on how he is trying to deal out the punishment for your relationship's benefit, now he's more focused on safety, and then the punishment is not running the course that it needs to do or doing its job the way it needs to.
So now that we've covered kind of like why you want to develop this habit of staying in position, there are some things that both taken in hands and head of households can do to facilitate that process being successful. The first real way to try to develop the skill of staying in position starts before a paddle or implement is ever picked up. And that is the mental preparation that goes into punishment.
And this is a very good point that Aria brings up. The punishment always begins with everything being set. Don't think that preparing, just like you would prepare anything, that is a step that you should just jump over. Preparing for that part of the punishment is key for the punishment to go well. So this is a step that I would encourage you, don't skip. Make sure if this is a problem that you've been having in the past, maybe this is a step that you are skipping. And so make sure that you really take time to prepare well and get set before you start the punishment.
So what does that preparation look like? For most couples, they do use corner time before punishments.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great step to include to facilitate that mental preparation, because really that mental preparation is all about getting the taken in hand partner to understand their fault and to be prepared to accept accountability. Because I know for myself that if I don't feel like I did anything wrong, or I can understand what I did was wrong, but it was for a good reason, it's really hard for me to yield myself to punishment and stay in position when I don't feel like I really deserve to be punished. So it's really getting to that place where I can recognize I really do deserve this punishment, and because I deserve it, I'm going to do my best to stay in position and accept it.
And that's one reason why when you are doing punishment, however you have it set up, and we've talked a lot about on our podcast how our punishment is set up, head of households, that's why it's so important as you go through, so to have those lecture points, to have those times as you're talking through, because this also helps set up the preparation at every point of the punishment. Even if you're at the very, very end of the punishment, if you're in the middle, no matter what it is, this is very key.
It is really important to have that lecture, because that is when you can really lay out what happened and why it deserves punishment. That's when you can get her to confirm that punishment is necessary. That's when you can really lay it out and see where the taken in hand partner, where they are mentally, to know do we need extra corner time? Do we need some extra mental preparation here? Because if you're in that lecture and you're getting kind of a combative response or no response at all, those are all signs that you need some extra mental preparation.
Absolutely. And those can be, again, things that you, obviously, if you're in the heart of the punishment, you want to address these things afterwards. But these are things that will help you then tweak the punishment for next time. And it could be that they're not responding to the punishment well, but it could be what Aria just said, that you didn't do enough in the preparation phase that is causing that to happen.
However, I would challenge that if you are in the heart of the punishment and you stop to make a lecture point and you're getting that response, utilize a corner time mid-punishment and then
Yes.
come back and finish, because you will find more success in that than trying to finish it out and then addressing it afterwards, because you'll find that her attitude doesn't necessarily lend itself to having been corrected. So having time to reflect, having time to accept that punishment is necessary, understanding that punishment is deserved, that all helps in the mental preparation. The other aspect that helps me, and I know that some couples do this, some couples do not, but if you're not doing this, you might want to consider it, is that I know what kind of punishment I'm getting going into the process. So for us, we have 4 levels of punishment, from light to medium, hard, and severe. And so before a punishment, I know what level of punishment I'm in for. And I kind of know what that entails. And so I can kind of mentally go through, visualize getting the punishment, and visualize myself staying in position through those harder swats. This might sound silly, but it is a proven technique that has been used across the board. Many, many people use visualization exercises to visualize the outcome that they want to have.
And head of households, this is another area where I've talked about before, where I, as the head of household, will come out and give myself time to prepare. This is where you need to encourage or take it in hand to prepare if they're not, because this may be an area where it is only one-sided. When you're coming out to prepare before they come out for their punishment, if they're not mentally preparing themselves, as Aria was just talking about, this is an area that you need to maybe investigate more and talk to them. Do you prepare yourself mentally when I go to prepare myself mentally before we come back together for the punishment? Because maybe they're not, and maybe that's the reason why they're having a problem, and maybe you need to help them with that visualization, or talk about how that they can do that in the process by the time you get to your next punishment.
And this is something that can happen whether or not you use corner time. If they're standing in the corner, you can kind of direct what you want their mental process to be to help them facilitate that success. Now, if you don't use corner time, or if you're finding that you need just a little extra motivation, assign them to write a written apology right before the punishment. So if, like Koda was saying, he comes out to prepare himself, I typically take that time to prepare myself. But if you feel like you need extra preparation, go ahead and say, I'm going to go ahead and head out to prepare for the punishment. I want you to take the next 15 minutes and write an apology for your behavior. And that kind of just puts her in the mental headspace to not only recognize what she did wrong, accept the punishment, but also just really internalize that accountability and that need for the punishment. And when you see the need for it, when you see that, you know, that punishment really is like necessary to correct what happened, you're more likely to participate in it by staying in position.
Yes, and in that, as Aria just mentioned, you know, writing an apology, these are different things that obviously you want to talk through, because everybody's preparation might be different. So really what we're getting towards is that you need to find out what works for your relationship and works for you as a person, because we're all different and we can prepare differently. But obviously we're trying to give you some tools here to help you with that. But really, you'll have to kind of talk about that and decide what will help you. And there's a dozen ways that you can go about that.
As always in this podcast, we paint with broad strokes and we try to give you a lot of ideas. You're not going to use every single idea that we give you. You're going to try out and really assess what works for you and what doesn't, and use what works and throw out the rest, of course. The next step to staying in position is the physical aspect of staying in position, but there is some ways to support that. And so we're going to kind of talk through the ways you can physically support your partner in staying in position. And this is going to be a little bit more geared to the heads of household because you're the ones that conduct the punishment. You're the ones that pace the punishment. And so this really is your arena to help your partner. So the first and most practical way that you can help your partner maintain position is be careful with the position you're asking them to maintain. There are definitely positions that are more comfortable, more easily maintained, and then there's positions that are a little bit more acrobatic or impractical. And this is another point in choosing position is we use paddles. Paddles carry a lot of force. So when the strike of the paddle comes down, it does propel me forward. And if I am against the piece of furniture, that can kind of absorb some of that force so that I don't lose balance. So really consider the implement you're using too, because if you're using an implement that carries a lot of force, then you want to take that into consideration.
So what we're trying to say behind all of this is that it may sound a little counterintuitive when we're telling you to find something that's comfortable or a position that works for you. But really, when you're doing something like a punishment, just because it's a punishment doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some amount of comfortability to it. Because the problem is that the punishment is going to be worse and it's not going to have the effect that you want it to have if your partner is feeling uncomfortable from the start to finish, because all they're thinking about is how uncomfortable they are rather than what the punishment is trying to do, and that is to change the behavior and to help them learn from their mistake. Yes, the spanking is very uncomfortable, but that's the only part you really want them thinking about in terms of being uncomfortable, not the position that they're in. And so that's why we're harping on this, and it may seem counterintuitive, but it really is important.
You really do want to choose a position that's easy to maintain, that sets them up for success so that they have the best possible chance to succeed.
And Aria brought up a good point. You want to do everything that you possibly can to let your taken in hand think that you have their best interests in mind. You don't ever want them to think, oh, they're purposely doing this to me because they're trying to get back at me. So it's not enough that I'm in a punishment, they're trying to get revenge. You never want that to come into their mind, and that may not even be your motive. In fact, it shouldn't be your motive at all. But you don't underestimate that if you overlook some of the things that we're talking about, that possibly communicate that. So you want to take all of those variables out of that so that your taken in hand really does feel like you have their best interest in mind and that you're trying to follow through with what you promised you would do to help them.
The next thing that you can do to physically support the efforts of the taken in hand to maintain that position is use a warm-up. We found that it's really important for my success to maintain that position to use a warm-up. And some people don't like using a warm-up because they think like, oh, that's just adding on to the punishment, or that, oh, well, if you give them time to acclimate to those harder swats, then it's really less impactful. That's not the case. It's not the case for me, and it's not the case for anyone else that I've ever heard that uses warm-up, because by the time you get to those harder swats of punishment, it's hard to take. It is still very much impactful for a tool of correction and for the punishment itself. The warm-up does not take away anything from the overall punishment, but it does give the taken in hand a way to kind of ease into it, to acclimate to it, so that they can have success in their efforts to maintain position.
Think of it this way. When Aria first said a warm-up would be helpful to her during punishment time, I was actually thought to myself, I can't believe I didn't think about that before, because athletes will warm up before a game. There's a lot of instances where you can think about when someone's getting ready to do something that they will warm up. Once she brought that to my attention and we started doing it, It is hard at first because you feel like, oh man, why do we have to do a warm up going into the punishment? But what you do find out is that warm up really does set you up for success. It really gets you both from that separation that you were in to get your mind in the right place. It brings your minds together. It gets you all focused on the punishment, warms her up, gets her ready so that you then can proceed in the punishment. And so really at first I thought, oh man, how is this really going to help? And it's just going to add extra time and all of these different excuses. But it really has been one of the most important parts of the punishment process. And I would highly recommend that you don't skip this step.
So the last point that I could think of that would really help physically support your take it in hand is really consider how you are pacing the punishment.
Good point.
Because I know that I've heard from other taken in hands that punishments are hard and fast and they don't stop. That can be really, really hard to take. And yes, punishment should be hard to take. However, if you allow just a little bit more rhythmic pacing, that can help the taken in hand be able to stay in position.
This is something that we'd had a lot of conversation about. And so you probably are so sick and tired of hearing us on the podcast talk about always have a conversation. But this is after every punishment that we've had, really where we've gotten to where the punishments are really now effective. And I'm happy to say that I really feel like we have really found for us a punishment system that really works. And I hate to use the word perfection, but it's pretty close for us. But that's because we had a lot of conversations about pacing, about how many numbers of swats, all of those kind of things that go into making an effective punishment. So don't underestimate talking with your partner after the punishment. I would not recommend during, but after the punishment about whether the pacing was good or bad or okay, and how you would fix that for the next punishment.
So for us, that means that, during the warm up that, COTA those swats are not as hard. They're the warm up, they're building. And so those swats are more continual, but when he gets into the harder swats of the punishment, he will, during that mid section, and maybe we should do an updated podcast about how we do
actually
punishment.
That probably would not be a bad idea.
And so we have like the warm up, then we have like the mid section, and then we have the finishing. And so during that mid section, the swats are closer together, but every 10 swats, he will pause. And those pauses really do allow him to reiterate with lecture, with words. He can ask questions. He can reiterate the lesson behind the punishment. And so those pauses aren't just there to give me time to kind of have a little bit of reprieve, to acclimate, to ready myself. It really is there for him to re-emphasize the lesson as well. So they are pauses with purpose.
And that's a good point. Pauses with purpose. So they serve a dual purpose. And don't underestimate how important that really is for you and your partner. Time for you to reiterate why the punishment is happening, ask the questions like she was saying, but also give her a reprieve.
And I know for myself that because I can somewhat keep track of where we are in that set, I don't always, but most of the time I can count to 10 still. And so I can ready myself, and then I'm kind of keeping track of how many swats I've received. And it really does help me go, okay, I just have to maintain my position for these 10, and then I can exhale, then I'm going to get a little reprieve. And it really does help me stay in position during that midsection, which is almost the hardest time to maintain position. Now, during the last part of our punishment, that's when I'm bending over. Those are the hardest swats physically. And because of that, COTA does give me just a few seconds in between, because he understands, and I think this is a really good point, your taken-in-hand partner is not going to be perfectly still.
Nope, especially for that last part.
When I am receiving those last swats, he knows that they are very, very difficult to take. And so he'll give me the swat and wait just a few seconds, like maybe 2 or 3 seconds. It's not long, but then he'll deliver the next swat. And again, give a 2 or 3 second pause. Those pauses do not have words associated with them. They are silent. But every 10 of those swats, he will take a somewhat longer pause. He will reemphasize the lesson, hit any other lecture points that he has. But he also allows me to get water during those points.
The reason we do them in those increments is because we do not want to lose the momentum of that section, because that is very, very important. This is, again, another important part of punishment that you don't want to skip over, but it's very, very key. And spacing that way, I feel like that last part of the punishment really works, again, very, very well for us.
So again, if you have a partner that is really having a hard time, really consider how you can use the pacing and rhythm of the punishment to support their efforts. Because that's really what all of this is about, is just supporting those efforts. Because we're talking to taken in hands that really do want to stay in position. They really do want to develop that skill, because it is a skill and it is a habit. And because it is a habit, it can be trained.
Absolutely.
So the last part of this podcast, we're going to be talking about how you can support your taken in hand partner through training. Because like any skill, practice and training really can help develop that skill further.
Really what this comes down to is the more you do something, and the more you do something with intention. Each time you go to practice, you have a purpose on what needs to happen in order to accomplish the goal that you're trying to get to.
So if you have a taken in hand partner that is really struggling to maintain position, before each punishment, remind them what they are expected to do. Remind them that they are expected to stay in position, but be realistic about what constitutes breaking position. Because like we said, movement is going to happen. Physical responses to pain are going to happen, but you can still have some parameters.
For example, if she stands up, if she reaches back, if she moves her leg too far, there's a certain area, and she's got a pretty good window there, but there's a certain area where if she goes outside that window, she's out of position and it's no good. But I do give her some leeway.
So how you can correct those breaks of position is, because you do want to train them out, so you do need to offer correction, is first give a verbal correction, give a verbal warning. Especially if this is a habit that has been developed, the habit of breaking position, or you're trying to break that habit, give a warning first. Or if this has something that you've been working on for a while, you might skip the warning step, but definitely give that verbal command to stay in position. If it continues, then you need to think about how you are going to correct that behavior, because even though it is a natural response to the stimulus of the punishment, it is still a behavior that needs to be corrected.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the past, when that happened with you, we just kind of stopped that portion of the punishment, made you go back to the corner, and then we began again.
Yes.
After some time.
That is an option. You can say, if you break position, then we are going to start the punishment over. And then that can make your punishment last quite a while. And she's going to get to the point where she understands that if I want this done quickly, that I'm not going to break position. You could also give penalty swats, where, you know, every time you break position, you're going to get 2 swats to your thigh, which are very painful. Act as a very good deterrent.
That's very true.
And tell them, like, if you break position, then you are going to get 2 swats that don't count towards your punishment.
Right.
And they are going to land on your thigh, so that you learn that you don't want to break position, or it's going to be bad for you.
That's right.
Also, you could tack on another punishment, whether that is like, hey, you broke position during this punishment, so you're going to have a 15-minute corner time, and then you're going to get a spanking. for breaking position. Or you can say, you know, you're going to be required to sit on a hard surface or even a uncomfortable surface, like a little spiky mat or something. You're going to have to sit on that for a timeout because you broke position. And believe me, sitting on a hard surface, especially an uncomfortable surface, on a freshly spanked bottom is an extension of the punishment. That's something that they will want to avoid. You can have them write lines or write a report on the importance of maintaining position during punishment. All of those are options. I think the most common is probably just adding the penalty swats in the moment to correct every break of position.
Or just having that timeout that we had talked about, that Aria and I used to do, whether she broke position, we called timeout, she went back to the corner, and then we started basically that section of that punishment over.
Yes. So those are common ways to train out that behavior because, again, it's a behavior that can be trained, can be developed. And I think that if you take all of these things into consideration where you are mentally preparing to accept a punishment, you are helping your take-it-in-hand partner to mentally prepare. You are considering the position that you use along with the implements that you use, and you choose something that is easily maintained throughout the punishment. You set the pacing of the punishment to where it allows some reprieve and some acclimation to the harder swats. That can set them up for success. And if all else fails, train out the behavior with consequences.
And remember, when we were talking about this idea of practice earlier, practice doesn't make perfect. Practice just makes permanent whatever it is that you're practicing. So if you're practicing bad habits, those will become permanent. So that's why we say make sure every time you practice, every time you have a punishment, whatever it is that you're doing, you have a clear goal in mind. You know what it is you're going to do. If you make tweaks, make those tweaks and have those as goals for the next time so that your practice does make a good, permanent punishment system that works for you and your partner.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. We really do hope that these tips helped you. Again, if you want to support the channel further, get our bonus content as well as access to our Discord server, a link to our Patreon is down below. And until next time.
See you later.